My son tried to commit me to get my inheritance, but he didn't count on my lawyer. I always dedicated my life to my family, especially to my son, whom I raised alone after the loss of my husband. I believed that love and sacrifice would be enough to guarantee respect and gratitude. But as the years passed, I noticed strange signs, subtle detachments, and attitudes that made me doubt myself. What seemed like care turned out to be something much darker. That's when I realized that my freedom, my lucidity, and even my inheritance were at risk, and all of it coming from the person I trusted most. But life is wise. When all seemed lost, I found strength where I least expected it. A new struggle began, and with it, a version of myself I never knew. Today I can say that my story is not just about betrayal. It's about courage, truth, and rebirth. I am immensely happy to have you here. Follow my story to the end and tell me which city you are watching from. I want to know how far my voice has reached. It was hard to explain, but something in Jonathan had changed. He and Linda seemed to live in a world of their own within the same house. The glances exchanged between them carried something I couldn't name, but felt deeply. The coldness was subtle at first, disguised as fatigue, commitments, and distractions. But soon it turned into silence, and silence became an insurmountable barrier. Every attempt at conversation was met with impatience. "We'll talk about it later, Mom," was Jonathan's standard phrase, always in a hurry. Linda in turn just smiled, that smile that didn't reach her eyes. I began to wonder if I was imagining things, if it was just a phase. But what was once routine became distance, and I found myself increasingly alone in my own home. Meals once shared now happened without warning. I would discover dirty dishes in the sink and muffled laughter upstairs. When I questioned it, evasive, almost automatic answers came. "It was just a quick snack," they would say. I didn't know what I had done to deserve that estrangement, but something told me it wasn't just neglect. Gradually, I began to realize that my simple gestures were a cause for annoyance. A forgotten note, a repeated question, everything seemed to irritate them. But it was in Jonathan's gaze that I felt the greatest pain. There was no longer any affection there, just something practical, evaluative. "Why does he look at me as if I were a problem to be solved?" The words began to change, albeit with smiles. "Don't you think you're getting a little confused, Mom? Or remember what you said yesterday?" "No." They said this as if placing pieces on a board, calmly. I started to doubt myself. I forgot a neighbor's name. I mixed up birthday dates. But who doesn't do that with age? Jonathan began to repeat stories as if they were worrying. "She went out with the wrong purse the other day," he told Linda, as if I wasn't in the room. Linda nodded, with pity in her eyes. Reality seemed to dissolve into their interpretations. With each year confused again. A crack opened inside me. One day, I walked into the kitchen and found a list on the refrigerator. "Things Mom forgot this week." It was handwritten with dates. The gesture seemed harmless, but it carried a suffocating weight. Who needs to prove their mother is getting confused? What's the purpose of this accounting of failure? I started leaving notes for myself, trying to prevent any new accusations. But anxiety made me forget where I had put them. The fear of making mistakes made me make more mistakes. I felt trapped in a labyrinth of expectations and suspicions. Maybe I am forgetting too much? Or do they want me to think that? One morning, Jonathan woke me up earlier than usual. "Let's go out, Mom. It'll be quick." He didn't explain where, nor did he give me time to get ready properly. Linda was already ready in the car with that polite smile. I thought it was strange, but I went. On the way, I tried to make conversation, but they were both evasive, exchanging silent glances. We stopped in front of a mirrored building. "Doctor's office?" I asked. Jonathan replied. "It's just a checkup. Nothing serious." But there was no appointment scheduled on my calendar. They seemed prepared, while I felt like an intruder in my own life. The receptionist was already waiting for me by name with papers ready. In the office, a general practitioner asked me generic questions, without looking me much in the eye. "Are you eating well? Sleeping regularly?" Everything seemed too standardized. When I questioned if there was any specific reason, he smiled and said it was just prevention. Jonathan sat beside me impassive. At the end of the consultation, Jonathan asked to speak with the doctor alone. When they came out, they handed me an envelope. Inside, more papers, more bureaucracy. "Just sign it, Mom." Trust us. I wanted to read it, but Jonathan took the lead. The pen was already in his hand, and the next sentence chilled me to the bone. You need to sign some papers, Mom. It's for your own good. 2 days later, Jonathan insisted on taking me to a routine follow-up, this time with the Dr. Harold Green. He made it seem like a procedural matter, a requirement of the health plan. I was suspicious, but I didn't want to argue. Maybe I was just overreacting. On the way, Jonathan spoke little, fiddled with his cell phone, and sighed too much. In the office, Dr. Green was polite but distant. He took notes on a pad for every answer I gave, even the most trivial ones. What did you do on the weekend, madam? What's today's date? Do you know where we are? I answered everything calmly, but he seemed more interested in how I answered than in the content. This bothered me. I tried to engage in a more human conversation, talking about my routine memories of my husband, but he just kept taking notes. Continue, he would say from time to time, as if I were being recorded. I felt no empathy, no warmth. It was as if I was giving a deposition rather than talking about my health. At one point, I noticed Jonathan watching from the side like a backstage evaluator. The consultation ended and I felt exhausted, even without exams. He wrote down everything I said but never looked me in the eye. When we got home, Jonathan handed me a notebook. If you want, you can reread this, Mom. It was a diary, but not mine. I flipped through it and recognized my handwriting in some passages, but there were many notes I didn't remember writing. You've been forgetting to record, so I completed some parts for you, he explained. The dates matched days when I had indeed felt more distracted, but the words there seemed exaggerated. There were phrases like, I didn't recognize my own reflection today, and Jonathan told me I'm confused again. I would never write like that. It sounded more like a script than a confessional. Jonathan said he would take the diaries to Dr. Green on the next visit. He tried to appear caring, saying it was to help with the follow-up, but I realized the intention behind his words. They were building a narrative, a record to be used against me. My stomach churned. Linda appeared at the door and said in a casual tone, He said you didn't recognize your own name last week. I looked at her, not understanding. He said you didn't recognize your own name last week. From that day on, everything I said was met with caution, as if my words were under suspicion. I felt the weight of every word, every memory. I began to doubt my own sanity. What if I was really forgetting? What if it was the beginning of something irreversible? But my intuition screamed. Something was wrong. Linda's glances were increasingly inquisitive, as if she expected a failure at any moment. Jonathan was more impatient. Mom, you need to trust us. But trust is not something demanded. It is something cultivated. And there the soil was dry, arid. I felt like a defendant being evaluated without the right to defense. I started to avoid talking too much, afraid of fueling new notes. The house, once my fortress, was now a territory of subtle traps. Happy memories seemed to fade before the dark present. I felt like a visitor in my own home. That night I went to my room and locked the door, something I never did. I sat on the bed, hugged the pillow, and felt my heart beating faster than ever. He wants to commit me. My own son. I felt I needed to talk to someone who didn't see me as a burden. I called Martha and asked her to visit. As soon as she walked through the door, she hugged me tight and said I looked smaller than she remembered. I broke down. I told her everything. The glances, the papers, the forced consultation, the altered diary. She listened in silence, her eyes attentive and her expression serious. This isn't right, Dorothy, she said firmly. This goes beyond health concerns. I agreed, feeling tears stream down uncontrollably. I asked if I was becoming paranoid, but she emphatically denied it. Paranoia is when we imagine things. What you're telling me has a pattern, an intention. Her words warmed me like a blanket on a cold day. She mentioned Paul Whitmore, our old lawyer. If anyone can guide you now, it's him. I hesitated. It had been years since I'd spoken to Paul, but the memory of his steady voice brought me relief. You need to protect yourself, my friend, Martha said. And fast. The whole thing seemed like a dark puzzle assembling itself before me, piece by piece. Martha squeezed my hand and looked me in the eyes firmly. This could turn into a tragedy if you don't act. I felt fear, but also a small flame of courage igniting. He'll know if this is legal or not. The next day I tried to call Paul, but the house phone was gone. I asked Jonathan and he said, casually, that he had taken it to fix it. When I asked to borrow his cell phone, he brushed it off. Mom, you're getting very confused with numbers lately. My throat went dry. They were isolating me even from the outside world. I asked to use the computer and he replied, let's talk about it later. I think it's better for you to rest. What do you mean rest? I was lucid, more attentive than ever. But I realized that every attempt at autonomy was being silently blocked. As if the world was shrinking around me, controlled by hands that pretended to care. Linda appeared in the hallway with a glass of juice. Relax a bit, Dorothy. You're getting too stressed. Her tone was sweet, but her gaze was calculated. I went to the room and closed the door, feeling as if every wall in the house became thicker, further away from my voice. It was as if they were preparing the ground for an invisible coup. I started writing in a notebook hidden inside the closet, trying to keep my memories alive. I wrote down dates, phrases I heard, strange attitudes. If I couldn't speak, writing would be my resistance. She needs to rest. The confusion is getting worse. While tidying one of the drawers in the old bookcase, I found a folder hidden among old papers. Curious, I opened it. Among ancient documents, I discovered notes with figures, properties, accounts, all referring to my husband's inheritance. There was even a patrimonial map I had never seen before. My heart raced. It was too detailed, too profound, too planned. Attached to the document was a small post-it in Jonathan's handwriting. Check need for legal guardianship. The words seemed to scream. It was no longer about care, nor even about family disagreement. It was an act of possession, a plan. He didn't just want to silence me. He wanted to erase my autonomy, my history. The figures were underlined with a highlighter. Some properties I didn't even remember being in my name. There was the real reason behind the sudden concern. It wasn't age. It was money. The inheritance my husband had left with such care was now the prize that justified my surrender. I closed the folder slowly, as if it could explode in my hands. But at that moment I was sure. I wasn't losing my mind, they were trying to steal it. He wants everything. And he won't stop. Martha, always shrewd, brought an old phone hidden in her bag. We called from the guest room, with the door locked and our breathing held. The first person to answer was a young woman named Emily. She said she worked in Paul's office. He's in a meeting, she informed, but Martha took the phone from my hand and spoke with urgent firmness. It's about Dorothy Simmons. It's urgent. Soon I heard his voice, still recognizable, though hoarser with time. Dorothy? What's going on? When I replied, my voice faltered. Paul. They're trying to erase me. I told him everything quickly, between sobs and lapses. He listened to me in deep silence. Emily stayed on the line, taking everything down carefully. They're trying to use my age, Paul. They want to commit me. There are papers, documents. They're making things up. My voice trembled, but inside me there was something new, indignation. Paul didn't hesitate. He said he would come to see me personally the next day. Emily promised to retrieve old archived documents to recall details of our last power of attorney. Before hanging up, Paul said something that made me shudder. Dorothy, if what you told me is true, we are dealing with something serious. Her voice trembled, but it was firm. I need to talk to Paul. Now. Paul arrived discreetly in the late afternoon, under the pretext of being a longtime friend. Jonathan was out and Linda had gone shopping. I received him with a contained hug. There was no time for emotion. We went straight to the point. He listened to everything in silence, but his eyes grew darker and darker. I told him about the fake diaries, the psychiatric consultation, the hidden papers. I showed him the notes I found about the inheritance. Paul examined each sheet like a detective before a crime map. This is serious. If these documents are presented in court as proof of incapacity, they can get guardianship. He was silent for a few seconds, then murmured, I remember a power of attorney your husband left. It protects you, or it protected you. He looked up at me. If Jonathan has altered it, we're dealing with something much dirtier than we thought. That chilled me to the bone. I felt the pieces starting to connect, but I didn't know where it would all lead. The truth was being suffocated by a forged narrative. If he has altered this, We are dealing with something much dirtier. Before leaving, Paul promised me something that filled my eyes with hope. I will investigate discreetly, Dorothy, without raising suspicion. He said he would talk to Emily and access bank records, notary records, property history. If there's any movement, we'll know. For the first time in days, I felt protected. He advised me to maintain a calm appearance. Don't let them realize you know. I agreed. I would do my best to protect my lucidity and my freedom. Paul wrote everything down as he always did, but his eyes told me he was already planning the next steps. He believed in me. Martha reappeared with a discreet smile, as if she knew the tide was beginning to turn. But I also knew that the closer we got to the truth, the more dangerous it would all become. Jonathan was not a man who backed down, and now he was playing to win. Paul, as he said goodbye, looked at me with the seriousness of a judge. If my suspicions are correct, we have little time. I began to do exactly what Jonathan wanted. Act as if I were confused. At first it was painful to pretend, as if I were giving up on myself. But I understood that it was the only way to move forward without raising suspicion. I hid my true notebooks, started speaking wrong dates, and took longer to answer simple questions. Jonathan seemed satisfied, as if his plan was working. Linda watched me more closely, like an informal nurse. Sometimes she would whisper with Jonathan, and I pretended not to notice. I smiled at her as if I didn't understand her intentions, and she smiled back, thinking she was winning. The role reversal hurt me, but it was a strategy. And the more I aired, the more confident they felt. Paul would call me at alternating times, under the guise of an old friend named Walter. If Jonathan answered, Paul would pretend he had dialed the wrong number. I already knew, when he said the weather is closing in, it was a sign that there were discoveries. And the weather, in fact, was starting to close in on them both. I could feel it. One morning, seeing me confuse the order of cutlery at breakfast, Jonathan chuckled discreetly. "You're really very forgetful, aren't you, Mom?" And I just nodded with downcast eyes and an alert heart. "You're really very forgetful, aren't you, Mom?" Meanwhile, Emily was playing her own part in the investigation. One afternoon, while checking outgoing documents from the office, she noticed a strange correspondence with my name. It was an envelope addressed to the notary's office with a supposed authorization from me for patrimonial transfer. But she found the haste with which it was delivered for dispatch strange. She decided to open it before it was too late. Upon analyzing the signature, she realized something was wrong. The handwriting looked like mine, but the hand, it wasn't the same. "Paul, this signature was made with the left hand, and Dorothy is right-handed." They sent it to the notary's office anyway, hoping it would go unnoticed. But they didn't count on Emily's attention. She made copies, scanned the document, and held the sending until Paul personally analyzed it. When he confirmed the forgery, the plan became clearer. They wanted to transfer assets while I was still alive, but legally incapacitated. It was the final piece of the puzzle. They were ready to erase me legally. Paul immediately called the bank and requested a temporary block due to suspicious activity. Emily returned to the office with the document in her bag, taking a deep breath. This was signed by her, but with the wrong hand. That night, Jonathan said he had scheduled a new appointment. "This time it will be more complete. Dr. Green wants to see you again." I feigned surprise, confusion, even gratitude. "It's good that someone looks out for me," I murmured, looking at the floor. Linda smiled, satisfied, as she served me tea. The trap was set, for me or for them. Feigning tranquility was exhausting. In the mirror, I saw a woman who had fought too much. But I couldn't falter now. This definitive evaluation was the chance they hoped to neutralize me. I needed to get there intact and leave with my dignity intact. It was the final battle before the outcome. With Martha and Paul in position behind the scenes, we coordinated signals, timings. Emily was already preparing the dossier with evidence. Still, fear crept in during the early hours. What if there wasn't enough time? What if they succeeded? I knelt before bed, as I did in the darkest days of my youth. When I said goodbye to Martha that night, I squeezed her hand tightly and asked in a low voice, "If I don't get through this, tell the truth, please." Emily spent days rummaging through old files in Paul's office basement. Among dusty folders, she found tapes and recordings of my conversations made years earlier, records kept after meetings about the inventory. In all of them I spoke clearly, mentioning names, dates, values, legal decisions. It was impossible to ignore the lucidity of my speech. She watched each segment carefully, writing everything down. Those tapes, though old, disproved any narrative of mental incapacity. There were records of me deciding on investments, advising Paul on a donation to an orphanage. No trace of confusion, no sign of dementia. Emily knew. This could change everything. When she showed Paul, he stood up in silence, his face serious. This is pure gold, Emily. She's not only lucid, she's strategically lucid. They decided to use the recordings as a counterpoint to the diaries, altered by Jonathan. Living proof that my mental state had always been sound and consistent. The tide was beginning to turn. Emily sent everything to be digitized and included in the final dossier. She speaks dates, names, numbers. This isn't dementia. Paul spent the night organizing the dossier. He separated the recordings into thematic blocks: finances, medical decisions, legal correspondence. He also included copies of the forged signature and the notes I found in the bookcase. Everything would be presented to the psychiatric board that would determine my fate. It wouldn't just be a defense, it would be a calculated attack. He knew he couldn't directly accuse without proof, so he built the narrative based on documents. Each piece dismantled Jonathan's version. Emily took care of the order of the attachments. Paul reviewed legal arguments. It was like preparing a silent military operation. There was only one chance, and it was in their hands. In addition to the material, Paul drafted a final statement. In it, he described the pattern of psychological manipulation I had been suffering. This is an attempt to silence a lucid woman, merely for patrimonial interest, he wrote. Reading that, I felt I was not alone. For the first time, someone spoke on my behalf with justice. Emily handed over the sealed envelope with the evidence and looked at Paul seriously. This evidence will force Dr. Green to reconsider everything. While everything was being prepared behind the scenes, Linda began to grow suspicious. She noticed my subtle change in behavior. She no longer seemed so fragile, although she pretended well. One afternoon I listened behind the door. Have you noticed how she's more stable? Jonathan replied, irritated. She's faking it. I know. Linda began to search the house for notes or papers. She found an old notebook of mine and leafed through it, suspicious. She called Jonathan in a hurry and showed him the perfectly written dates. She wouldn't forget this if she were that confused. Their plan was starting to crumble. The mask of false fragility was wearing thin. Later, Linda called Jonathan from the hallway. We need to act sooner. They are preparing. It was the first time I noticed fear in her voice. The control they believed they had was slipping through their hands. They knew something was coming. And this time they would not be the protagonists of the outcome. That night I listened to the house in absolute silence, but I knew. The storm was close. They are preparing. We need to act sooner. It was late and I couldn't sleep. I got up to get some water and stopped when I heard low voices coming from the living room. The light was off, but the shadows indicated that Jonathan and Linda were talking near the hallway. I approached slowly, making no noise, and hid behind the slightly ajar door. I heard my name spoken coldly, as if it weren't me but an obstacle. My heart pounded as I heard the following words. Put a few drops in her tea. It won't cause anything permanent, just confusion and agitation. It was Jonathan's voice, firm, without hesitation. She'll appear completely out of her mind at the meeting. It will be undeniable for the psychiatrist. Linda asked if it was safe and he replied, she won't remember anything afterward. The strategy was clear. Simulate a drug-induced episode before the hearing. I moved away carefully, without letting them notice my presence. I felt a mixture of anger and despair. How could my own son plan something like this? It wasn't just a patrimonial coup, but a deliberate attempt to destroy my identity. This wasn't just betrayal. It was cruelty. And now I knew how deep he was willing to go. I went to my room, my legs trembling but my mind firm. She'll appear completely out of her mind. It will be undeniable. In the morning, I called Martha and asked her to come as quickly as possible. I told her everything in the backyard, where the walls were high and whispers were lost in the wind. Martha listened without interrupting, and her eyes widened with every detail. "They're going to drug you before the meeting?" she repeated, incredulous. I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and powerlessness. She took a deep breath and held my hands. "Then tonight I'm sleeping here. You're not going through this alone." Her decision was immediate, without hesitation. I insisted she didn't need to get so involved, but she shook her head. "Someone needs to be lucid when it all happens." Her words echoed like a promise, like an anchor in that troubled sea. We prepared everything carefully. Martha would have a glass identical to mine, and would observe every move by Linda and Jonathan. We agreed on subtle signals. If anything strange happened to my tea, she would swap it before I drank it. We knew the night would be long and the risk enormous. But I was no longer alone, and that made all the difference. As dusk fell, we feigned normality. Linda smiled. Jonathan gave me a kiss on the forehead. Someone needs to be lucid when it all happens. The next day, Paul appeared before dawn, wearing a dark suit and carrying a thick briefcase. His eyes held urgency but also conviction. "We're changing the plan. We can no longer wait for invitations or protocols." He had prepared everything: the recordings, the documents, my husband's letter. But he knew they would only work if presented at the right moment. "They are confident they will get the commitment today. Therefore, we need to anticipate." Paul knew the hospital would not easily allow his entry, so he planned to use a legal loophole. Emily was already there, infiltrated as the legal representative of a previous patient. Everything was timed. The hours seemed like seconds and every move had to be precise. Linda and Jonathan had already left. Martha helped me get dressed, her hands firm, like someone preparing a warrior for the battlefield. The hearing room would be cold, technical, but I couldn't show fear. Everything we had built so far depended on that moment. Paul said goodbye with a short nod and a firm look. "Trust." As he closed the door behind him, he just said, "The hearing will be at the hospital. 9 in the morning." As we got ready for the hearing, Martha appeared with an old, yellowed envelope. "I kept this all these years, Dorothy." He gave it to me and said it should only be opened if you were in danger. I opened it with trembling hands and recognized my husband's handwriting. The letter was direct, clear, and every word weighed more than gold. He said he feared that Jonathan one day might try to use his absence as a form of control. "If he tries to take what is yours, seek Paul. He will know what to do." My heart ached, but it also filled with certainty. My husband knew the son we raised. It was no longer just about the present. It was a warning from the past to protect me in the future. The letter even mentioned that the fortune should serve as an instrument of freedom, not imprisonment. Paul read in silence, and when he finished, he carefully put the paper away. "This changes everything, Dorothy." He foresaw it. I felt a wave of gratitude for that man who, even after death, still cared for me. Martha hugged me tightly. I just whispered, "If he tries to take what is yours, seek Paul. He will know what to do." Paul included the letter in the final dossier, adding an explanatory note about the date and Martha's testimony regarding the document's origin. This reinforces that there was a real risk foreseen and neglected by Jonathan. The content was now not only proof of lucidity but also of criminal premeditation. It was more than enough to cause legal doubt. Emily helped digitize the document and attach it with priority to the hearing material. The narrative constructed by Jonathan began to crumble before the truth written by his own father. "It's the strongest blow we have," Paul said. And I knew he was right. It wasn't just legal strategy, it was an act of justice. Paul organized his speech to open with the letter, then present the recordings and the altered documents. "We will invert the logic, prove that you are sane and that he is the one acting in a sick way." His words gave me strength. For the first time, I felt my voice would be heard, even through the writing of someone who had already passed away. Paul took a deep breath as he closed the folder. Now it's no longer a supposition. It's foresight and warning. But while we were preparing, Linda disappeared. Jonathan said she had left early to settle matters at the bank. Paul grew suspicious and asked Emily to contact notaries and flight records. The answer came hours later. A ticket had been issued in the name of Linda Rayford for abroad. She was planning to flee. The attempt was clear: escape before the scandal exploded. Paul acted quickly and filed a precautionary measure to freeze her assets. Her bank movements already showed attempts to transfer assets. It was no longer just support for the crime, it was active participation. Justice reacted with surprising agility. In the late afternoon, we received the call that sealed that day. She's at the airport. She was detained by federal police with a suitcase full of documents and jewels. Jonathan still didn't know. But when he found out, perhaps he would understand that the end of the game was near. The web he had woven was unraveling before the eyes of the law. Paul smiled for the first time in weeks. She's detained at the airport. The night before the hearing was strangely calm. Jonathan appeared in my room with a cup of tea. For you to sleep better. You're tense, he said with a forced smile. I knew what he intended. The strategy was old. To drug me before the meeting, creating the episode he had planned days earlier with Linda. But this time Martha was attentive, observing every detail with eagle eyes. I waited for the right moment and as Jonathan moved away, Martha discreetly swapped the cups. Mine went to her. Hers to me. We sat at the table as if nothing had happened. Linda arrived minutes later, late and distracted. She drank the tea without suspicion. Everything was set. And this time the blow would be reversed. A few minutes passed until Linda began to sweat. She said she was hot, even though the night was cold. She touched her forehead, looked around without focus. Everything is spinning, she murmured as she tried to get up. She stumbled to the armchair, breathless. Jonathan ran to help her, startled. Martha and I exchanged a silent, complicit, and certain glance. Linda grabbed Jonathan's arm, her eyes wide, and said in a trembling voice, I'm not feeling well. During the night, Linda's symptoms worsened. Her speech became disconnected, mixing past and present. She called for people who weren't there. At one point, she tried to pull paintings off the wall, saying they were watching. Jonathan, desperate, called emergency. No one quite understood what was happening, but the outburst was evident. In the ambulance, she screamed, cried, then laughed for no reason. The nurse asked Jonathan to accompany her. He agreed, his face pale, holding her hand as if trying to keep a boat afloat. Inside, I felt a strange mix of justice and sadness. I never wished anyone harm, but that was the missing proof. Hours later, I received an anonymous call from the hospital. Linda was under psychiatric observation, with strong signs of induced disorientation. The exact cause was still being investigated. But I knew. And so did Martha. That was the consequence of a cruel plan that turned against its own author. God knows how to put things right. Martha hung up the phone with wide eyes. She's saying disconnected things. As we prepared for the hearing, Paul received a call from the medical team. The nurse reported Linda's episode, describing symptoms and behaviors. Was any substance administered without a prescription? She asked. The nurse replied yes, but they were still investigating which one. Paul immediately understood that this was an opportunity. This changes the game, he said on the phone. If they try to invalidate Dorothy based on altered behavior, we'll have an identical case, but real. Linda's commitment, even if temporary, dismantled the coherence of Jonathan's plan. How can someone who claims to be caring cause this to their own partner? We decided to include the emergency report in the hearing material. It was recent, dated the night before. Paul knew it would be impossible to ignore this new element. Medicine and law would have to bow to the evidence. The madness was not mine, it was their plans. And now the masks were falling one by one. Paul closed the folder firmly. We have a new element that changes everything. I was escorted to the hearing room by a nurse. The room was cold with white walls and dense silence. Dr. Green sat in the center, flanked by two other board doctors. Jonathan was already there, with a serious expression. Linda's absence was justified by a sudden health problem. No one explained anything else. They began by reading the previous report, prepared by Dr. Green based on reports and records. The patient's condition is moderate dementia, with indications of risk to her integrity and autonomy. My hands were sweating, but my heart was firm. I knew my time to speak would still come, and that I wouldn't be alone when it did. The doctor began to ask protocol questions. I answered calmly, even knowing they already had their convictions formed. It was a rehearsed scene with a predictable outcome. Until the door opened. Paul entered with firm steps and an upright posture. He carried the folder of evidence in his hands. Everyone looked at him surprised. Dr. Green stared at him with discomfort. Paul asked to speak. The patient's condition is moderate dementia, with indications of risk. Paul formally introduced himself as my legal representative, invoking the right to defense. He was granted permission to speak. He opened the folder and, in absolute silence, distributed copies of documents, recordings, and the letter written by my deceased husband. The recordings were played audibly. My clear, firm, lucid voice filled the room. Every word of mine dismantled Jonathan's narrative. His face contorted in discomfort. Paul then presented the letter, read aloud by one of the doctors. "If he tries to take what is yours, seek Paul." My husband's prediction seemed to haunt that environment, like a truth that could no longer be silenced. Next, Linda's emergency hospitalization medical report was delivered, detailing the symptoms and the substance ingested. Paul concluded with a sentence that made the doctors exchange glances. "You are about to make an irreparable mistake, condemning a sane woman for interests that have nothing to do with mental health." Dr. Green leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. "You are about to make an irreparable mistake." After minutes of private conversation among the doctors, Dr. Green stood up. He looked at me, then at Paul, and finally at Jonathan. He said that, in view of the new elements presented, the previous evaluation would be suspended. No decision would be made until a new investigation, this time judicial, was carried out. The room fell silent. "We do not have the competence to determine commitment under such circumstances," he declared. My chest lightened with a single sigh. I would not be committed. I still had a voice. Dr. Green, though reluctant, acknowledged that there were serious inconsistencies. Jonathan tried to protest, but was restrained by one of the doctors present. The game was turning. Paul thanked the board for their ethical stance and pledged to deliver the complete documents to the authorities. I, sitting in the back, felt a tear fall. Not from sadness, but from silent victory. For the first time in weeks, the world seemed to believe me again. The final sentence was clear. The patient will not be committed, and the case will be forwarded to criminal justice. Now, I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you ever experienced something similar? Support the channel, subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. I'm leaving another story on the final screen that you will also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.